I'm 95. During the war, a voice whispered, "Run." But when I turned, there was no one standing beside me. What does a whisper mean when the world is burning? That's the thing I carry in afterimage that does not obey facts. It sits beside the records, the maps, the neat logbooks they keep in archives. It lives in my chest like a small, persistent ache. I want to tell you why that single, impossible whisper still matters, and why it came back to me in the shadow of a raging depot that smelled of petrol and old winter. If you value first-person history, subscribe now. The morning we found the fuel was a bone-deep kind of cold. It was December 17th, 1944, and the Ardennes had teeth. Frozen ruts cut the lanes. Breath hung as white where men moved. Engines idled like unwilling beasts. There were more jerry cans stacked in the snow than any of us expected to see tidal heaps of metal and hope. Records list the cache at Hansfeld at roughly 50,000 gallons. For the boys at the front, for those of us walking between tanks and trucks, it felt like we had stumbled into a private fortune. I remember the smell first, raw gasoline sharp as a headache. Men went quiet with it, as if the smell itself had gravity. Some laughed with the relief of children who'd been denied candy and now held it between grubby fingers. Others were practical checking seams, testing taps, just glad for something that could make an engine turn. You couldn't spend the odor of it. You had to turn it into motion. We stacked cans, passed them shoulder to shoulder, thinking in small, immediate terms. Fuel for now, for the next mile, for the next village. But details creep in later, into a story that was first told by hunger and cold. The paperwork arrives after the joy. Manifests are unfolded. Someone reads the ledger and the math, and what sounds like treasure begins to sound like an answer to a different question. How much is enough? Not enough, it turned out, was the cruel mathematical truth. The Hansfeld pile 50,000 gallons was a great thing for the men who found it. It was almost nothing when measured against the arteries that keep modern armies alive. War diaries and logistical reports, those dry things thermostat the emotion. They show the picture with a single clinical stroke. American supply lines were vast. In 1944, records of production and distribution show American oil and fuel output measured in numbers that sound monstrous even now. Allied pipelines ran from the Channel Cherbourg 2 points deep in France. Pluto, the pipeline under the sea, fed a continent in motion. The Red Ball Express became a named river of trucks, day and night, carrying fuel, ammo, food. Historians note that while the German war economy produced fuel in the tens of millions of barrels annually, US, and Allied production and access moved in a different stratum orders of magnitude greater. To a soldier, these are facts that read like a landscape. One side has bridges and roads to water. The other is scraping rivers with spoons. We touched the cans in Hansfeld with pride. We were children for a moment. Then someone with a ledger put it into words. 50,000 gallons here. Yes, but millions were burning elsewhere. Millions were being denied to the enemy. That was a phrase the men used sometimes, and it stuck. Deny the enemy. If you cannot let them have the fuel, burn it. Denial was a strategy some of us did not have to plan. We watched it happen. I had been close enough to see what men look like when their instruments of war become their livelihood. A Sherman or a Panther is a mechanical thing at first steel, rivets, a sleeping engine. Up close, with soldiers around it, it is a life. You learn its appetite, how many gallons a day it drinks, how it wants roads like a thirsty man wants water. Somewhere in the back of the supply officers' minds were spreadsheets and charts. But in the mud and cold, it was simpler. Without fuel, these beasts become monuments. The advance that winter was not like the romantic book pictures. It was not a clean line marching forward. The roads of the Ardennes were narrow, lined with trees, and with columns of vehicles clogged shoulder to shoulder. Men cursed at flares of frozen mud and mechanical failures, at drivers stuck or lost. Tanks idled for hours in long queues, tanks burning through precious fuel while waiting for a chance to be useful. The slow-moving jam turned fuel into an enemy that consumed itself. I remember standing near Lanzarote, watching tracks spin uselessly, a tank driver slapping at a fan belt, hands red from the cold and the frustration. We knew something about consumption rates. Historians and logs offer the blunt numbers. Heavy German tanks could drink exceptional amounts of fuel per hour compared to lighter Allied vehicles. A Tiger, in some conditions, burned through gallons at a rate that made supply officers blanch. Those numbers are the sort of thing that stop a plan. The German spearheads designed to smash through were chained by their own thirst. When the wells ran dry, the sharp point dulled. You can see it in photographs from the time. Columns halted, hatches open, crews standing and staring. Men traded ranges of incredulous, exhausted expressions. You'd hear it in the stories that later made it into testimonies. Officers baffled, panicked phone calls between commanders, and the grim business of abandoning perfectly serviceable steel because there was no gasoline left. It was not only a military problem, it was a human shame. Soldiers who had been taught to fight with pride found themselves surrendering to the arithmetic of barrels and pipelines. My memory stitches itself through these practicalities with images. A boy in a knitted cap laughing as he rolls a jerry can, an officer poring over maps with his breath fogging, a line of trucks idling so long that condensation froze in their radiators. You feel that contrast acutely, the immediate foolish joy of a found pile of fuel, and the methodical coldness of numbers that tell you it will not change the overall course. Then came Stavelot. We had heard rumors a place called Stavelot that, at different times, had been taken and retaken. A depot that the Americans, when they felt they could not spare the risk of leaving intact, chose to set on fire. Captain John Brewster's name appears in accounts as the officer who gave the order to destroy the Stavelot depot to ensure it would not fall intact into enemy hands. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis is recorded as having thrown the first incendiary. These are the sort of small facts that sit in the archives, like pebbles, each one has weight. What they did produced a pillar of smoke that the old men in the villages said could be seen for miles. They burned ditches, tanks of fuel, pumps, everything. War diaries and subsequent reports estimate that at Stavelot something in the region of more than 2 million gallons of fuel were consumed in the Inferno records, put the number roughly at 2,189,000 gallons destroyed. The figure is staggering. It was a decision that declared, in the most literal way, that denial could be as decisive as possession. I saw the column of smoke. I stood with others and watched it climb like a second sun. Flames licked at the sky, and the heat made the snow around it steam. It was enormous and obscene and beautiful in the way only terrible things can be. The smell of burning fuel is different from the smell of fresh gasoline. It has a chemical, burning edge to it, like an animal's last call. Men covered their faces, eyes watered. Some prayed, I'm not sure whom, if anyone. Others cursed. I heard a voice from a distance, and for a moment I thought someone had said, "Look at that." Then my whisper happened. It came so quietly, I almost thought it was my own thought made audible. "Run," it said, 2 syllables like a pulse. It might have been my fear made into sound. It might have been a corner of my mind issuing a sane command. Get away from the flames, get away from the targets. Or it might have been something else, a gut knowing, or the memory of a child learning when danger is near, or simply a stress hallucination. I will not assert what it was. All I can tell you is this: the whisper moved me the way the smoke moved the trees, subtle and inevitable. There were other sounds, a man shouting orders, a vehicle's engine backfiring, The distant boom of an artillery piece, but the whisper threaded through them, as if someone had cut the world with a knife. I looked to the sides. The faces around me were fixed on the fire. No one seemed to have heard. That is why the memory holds. It was private, a small light in a great dark. Reports later made sense of the larger picture. Stavello was not an isolated act of destruction. It was an example of a policy shaped by calculation. The Allied network could afford to deny resources because their industrial base and logistical reach were so broad. Pipeline and trucking networks had become instruments as decisive as guns. When a depot burned, it was an answer to a strategic problem. Better to burn 2 million gallons out of reach than let the enemy carry off a force that could keep a mechanized column alive. Men who had watched German columns advance knew how dependent those spearheads were on a steady flow of fuel. Once that flow stopped, their options narrowed rapidly. They could try to capture more. They could attempt to seize ports or refineries, or they could grind to a halt. In many cases, the halt was the worst. An immobilized tank is a tempting target. A stranded convoy is a wound that grows. I remember the first tank we saw abandoned, not because it had been shot, but because its crew had walked away in a terrible hurry. It sat half in the road, turret turned to one side, tracks still showing recent motion, like a beast that fell asleep mid-stride. Men walked past it with the small private grief of those who have seen reliable things fail. The British and American documentary photographs later showed columns of steel with hatches open and interiors empty. German accounts, Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann and others recorded in later interviews and diaries, talk about the humiliation and bewilderment. To be a soldier taught to depend on your machine, and then to find the machine as helpless as you were. There is an irony to how we measure victory. We train for heroism and tactics, but supply chains decide whether heroism has room to breathe. I watched, in those months, a shift in how people spoke. Where once they discussed maneuvers, they now spoke about pipelines and convoys as though those were the true generals. There was talk of Pluto, an almost comical name for the pipeline under the sea, but in effect it was deadly serious. It carried the fuel that would keep engines moving. Newsreels and engineers' reports later explained the enormous effort behind such systems. But on the ground, you see it in the idle of a tank, and you understand it with a kind of small, bitter clarity. We pushed onward after Hansfeld, and the joy at that small victory kept folding into a larger, colder comprehension. Every mile forward stretched a line of vehicles thinner, made the convoys longer, the wait times greater. There was an inevitability to logistics. The supply officer's map could be arithmetic and art both. Where to send a tanker, which road to keep open, which depot to protect. Every decision sent ripples outward. Sometimes those ripples broke in men's faces like waves. One night, it's a detail that has nothing to do with the grand narrative and everything to do with human memory. Slept with my boots on. You're taught to be ready, and in places like the Ardennes, that lesson becomes habit. My dreams that night were of engines, a chorus of started motors, and then a silence. I woke with the whisper still in my ear, or the echo of it. For years afterward, I could not separate the memory of the voice from the physical memory of the smell. Not all decisions were made in a single mind. Commanders like Piper or staff officers discussed options. There were desperate calls and conferring over map tables. The great names of strategy are often a blanket over the busier, grimmer work of logistics and denial. That morning at Stavello was a concentrated moment where order and chaos met. Orderly destruction to avoid greater gain for the enemy, chaos in the flames, and sooty devastation of a fuel-rich place. It is important to be precise about the facts we can be precise about. War records assembled by both sides and later studies present a scale that helps explain the demoralization of many units. When logistics favor one side to that extent, battle plans become subordinate to pipelines. One could read it as a cold arithmetic, the side that can keep its machines running well, with painful regularity, grind out the advantage. And yet, numbers do not explain everything. There is something else, something human, that sits between the columns of statistics. I have met many veterans over the years. Their eyes carry a similar glaze when they talk about long nights and lost friends and small moments of grace or terror. The whisper I heard that day is one such thing. It sits beside the statistics as an emblem. Maybe it is only fear, maybe a mind under strain, maybe a remnant of instinct. Whatever it was enough to bend my course for a handful of hours. After Stavilo started, orders became movement. Men were told to withdraw or reposition. Crews climbed back into half-cooled vehicles. Drivers kicked tires to see if anything would start. There was a peculiar mechanical choreography to retreat. The clattering of shutters, the clunk of gears, the zip of packs being worn. People moved like actors on a stage called necessity. You did not debate. You adapted. I remember, too, an officer folding his hands around a small thermos and offering coffee to anyone who wanted it. No salutes, no rank, just a brief mutuality in the cold. He was a small man with thick gloves and a face split by frost. He passed cups from hand to hand as though passing comfort. Those small mercies might seem inconsequential beside a depot consuming 2 million gallons, but they mattered in the steam and smoke. They were what kept men going when the machinery of war fogged into incoherence. As we moved away, the sky behind us was a false, bright orange. Flames made long, black feathers of smoke that the wind twisted into grotesque shapes. The forest around the main road seemed to retreat from the heat. Every so often a smaller blast would make the ground shiver. We trudged with packs and ropes, carrying only what we could shoulder. My boots left tracks that the snow tried to erase before dawn. There came a point where the whisper returned, like a footstep stepping into the same puddle twice. I cannot say whether it was triggered by the blast of a burning tank, or by my own realization that we were no longer safe merely by staying close. Run, it said again in my head, an imperative without explainers. This time I obeyed in a way I had never trained for. I moved faster. I did not know if running would keep me alive, or if it was a superstition dressed up as action. But action, any action, felt preferable to standing still. Men around me moved too, some with the same quickened stride, others with the slow, resigned walk of the exhausted. We were a mass of movements, each tiny decision adding up to a large, collective retreat. When I look back on that instant, I see all the small decisions that built the larger one. A hand gripping a strap tighter, someone calling for a halt to tend a sprain, another voice telling a story to keep fear from filling the silence. Beyond the immediate drama was the larger moral that has grown heavier in me as the years went by. Modern war is decided as much in factories and refineries as on ridgelines. We talk about bravery because we must. We honor it because courage is human and miraculous. But there is something almost brutal in the arithmetic of supply. No amount of courage will make an inert engine move without fuel. Stavalo proved that in a way the textbooks chronicle and the men on the ground felt. 2 million gallons burned gone so that a force could be denied and plans could be frustrated. The memory of that inferno did not leave me when I came home. For decades, I found that ordinary objects could pull it up an old fuel can in a museum, a newsreel clip, the statue in a small European town. Once, standing in a museum, I looked at a captured tank with its gauge frozen at empty. The sight made the old whisper stir like a wind under leaves. I could not tell whether the voice had been warning or saving me from something else. To be 95 with a whisper that refuses to explain itself is a strange companionship. It presses questions at me that we cannot answer without a map and a ledger and the honesty to admit that some things are both human and mechanical at once. There is more to tell. The Hansfeld caches, the long columns, the burning at Stavello, each of these moments is braided with others. The small tales of private men, and the larger public record of strategy. I have kept my mouth closed about many things through the years, because memory is a tricky thing. It edits, it softens, it sharpens what it needs to. But I also know that facts anchor memory. The figures 50,000 gallons found at Hansfeld, roughly 2,189,000 gallons burned at Stavello, sit in my mind next to the small, unquantifiable. The whisper, the boy laughing, the smell of smoke. Both the ledger and the private voice are true in their ways. The road ahead of that day led not to a single decisive clash, but to a slow tightening. Tanks without fuel became trophies for history books, symbols of a strategy that had failed at a late hour. Men who had been ready to risk everything found at the arithmetic of barrels and trucks had already made some questions irrelevant. For some units, the loss of mobility meant surrender. For others, it meant painful footmarch under winter skies. When the battle lines shifted and the maps were redrawn, the paper that explained those movements was full of names and numbers, but the paper did not carry the smell of burning that clung to our clothing for days. As the years stretched and I learned the language of archives and historians, I began to see how the great machines of industry had become quiet generals. Factories, pipelines, ports, these were the deep dice rolled long before men marched. And when those dice landed in favor of one side, the other found itself improvising an answer that often came too late or cost too much. There is a brutal logic to that, and a human cost that calculation cannot fully contain. I walked away from Stavello with others, boots carrying impressions that snow could not fully erase. My hands trembled not from cold alone, but from a knowledge that other men would not be so lucky, and that luck itself was shaped by an impersonal thing called logistics. The whisper stayed with me, sometimes gentle, sometimes insistent, like a metronome set to a tempo I could not change. The road curved that day, and in the bend we faced a crossroads of choices. Do we chase after more supplies? Do we try to secure ground? Do we keep moving at all costs? Commanders argued over maps. Men argued over trivialities to hide deeper fears. Every decision fractured into smaller ones made by smaller bodies of people. And tucked into my pocket was the harness of a conscience, the small private knowledge that whatever I did next would, somehow, be framed by that whisper. When we finally turned away for good, the smoke still smoked. For days, the sky remembered. Even now, in my quieter hours, I see the column lift and spread, and the way men moved beneath its specks of life, circling the maw of an end. Industry turned to flame. The whisper was not a miracle, not a map, not a prophecy. It was a small, private compass giving me a direction in a world that had been stripped to essential facts. Move or die, keep engines fed, or be overtaken. There are men who would read all this and nod with military clarity and move on to the next statistic. There are others who would read and feel the human pulse beneath. Both readings matter. The point I keep returning to is not piety or heroism, but a quieter lesson. The immense, industrial frameworks of modern war steer the lives of men in ways that are almost invisible until catastrophe illuminates them. And so I ran, if running is the right word. I stepped into motion ordained by a whisper, by a smell, by the heat on the skin, by a ledger that had already decided more than one life. We left behind machines and stories both. I did not run because I believed a supernatural voice called me. I ran because my body and my experience told me that staying still next to a field of burning fuel was a bad bet. There is an odd comfort in admitting uncertainty. I do not know whether the whisper saved me. I do not know whether it was only a memory's aftertaste or the primal thread of instinct we all carry. I do know I am 95, and the image of that fire is carved deep. I know the numbers recorded at Hansfeld and Stavello sit like mountains in researchers' notes. I know now as then that the war was decided in factories, pipelines, and convoys as much as on the sharp edges of tactics. We had nowhere to go but forward from there. Men read their orders, check their watches, and set off along the cold lanes. Smoke fringed the horizon as if the sky had been cut and its wand licked by flame. I kept my pace steady, keeping my breath even, letting the whisper, whatever it had been, fade into the background of an urgent day. Ahead lay more choices, more moments where the arithmetic of supply would beat the bravest plans, and where the small human acts of kindness and fear would be thrown against steel and fire. I do not tell this story to romanticize or to present myself as something I am not. I tell it because memory insists, and because there are lessons locked in the smoke. We moved into the gray, with the gyre of smoke behind and the long line of our own dim hopes ahead. Men tidied their packs. A child of a man clung to a photograph, folded in a breast pocket. A corporal swore softly at a radio that would not pick up clear signals. The world narrowed to feetfall, to the crunch of frozen earth, to the warmth of a thermos offered again and again. The whisper had told me to run. What it had meant beyond that single command was something I would have to reckon with for a very long time. And as we marched away from the inferno, as columns rearranged and supply officers busied themselves with routing and rationing, I held in my mind two things that refused to reconcile neatly: the ledger with its monstrous numbers and the thin, human voice that told me to move. One spoke in millions of gallons and strategic calculus. The other spoke in the intimate language of self-preservation and instinct. Both were true in their spheres. Both changed what came next. There were other scenes, other depots, other small triumphs and humiliations. But Stavolo, with its monstrous fire and obscene count of lost fuel, remained the clearest illustration of a truth we were only then beginning to name aloud. That modern war is, in many ways, an argument between industrial capacity and human will. The question that has pursued me since that smoke-filled winter is not whether courage matters. It does. The question is whether courage is enough when engines are starving and pipelines speak in volumes. We marched through the day and into a long dusk. By the time the pale of evening settled, the soundscape had changed. Fewer engines, more distant voices, the creak of sledges. Men traded quiet words, and the day's events settled into the small, private narratives people carry. The whisper kept returning like a refrain. Sometimes it was merely the memory of it. Sometimes it felt like fresh counsel. In the end, it did not tell me how the war would be won or lost. It only gave me a point of movement within the chaos. There are pages yet to turn. The detailed accounting of what burned, the diplomatic arguments over supply priorities, the aftermath for men who could not leave their machines behind. There is also the private accounting, the small ledger inside a man, where a whispered word and a recorded number both take up space. For now, I will leave you with that sight. Flames licking a winter sky, the smell of burned fuel, the column of smoke that became a landmark, and the whisper three letters that felt, in a frozen field, like a direction worth following. After that day, the small arithmetic of survival, where to put your feet next, which pack to sling heavier, whether to hand over a coat, slid into the larger arithmetic of war. Men who had once measured valor by the length of a charge began, almost embarrassingly, to measure by the number stamped on a drum of fuel. Discussions around the primus stove were less about heroic tallies and about how many gallons a column would need to cross the next ridge. It was a new language for risk, barrels, pipelines, tonnage. Reports compiled later make the logic clear in a cold way that does not feel cold when you stand inside it. Records show that Allied petroleum output and distribution in 1944 operated on a scale that made localized finds like Hensfeld meaningful to the individual but trivial in the theater-wide calculus. Historians have pointed to figures production and imports that measured in the hundreds of millions, even billions, of gallons, while German supplies dwindled into single-digit millions. That gap, expressed on paper as numbers, read on the ground as stopped engines and abandoned steel hulks. I remember, after we left the smell of Stavalo fading behind us, the sight of those hulks' metal carcasses that had lost their purpose. In the road we passed a half-buried fuel truck, its belly blackened, valves blown, the remains of canvas sides flapping in the wind like flags of a defeated idea. A soldier sat nearby, head bowed, staring at a strip of frozen ground where his life had, minutes before, been obvious. I thought about the men who had to destroy their own stores. Captain John Brewster and Technical Sergeant Paul saw us appear in the records as the officers who led the action, and how those acts of denial are not clean nor purely strategic. They carry a moral weight. To burn what you'd hoped to use is to practice a kind of grief with tools. It wasn't only, or even mainly, the destruction itself that altered the course of things. It was that once the enemy starts to worry, less about shortages, and more about the fact that you can almost casually destroy what you cannot spare, the enemy's psychology shifts. Accounts from German soldiers Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman among those later interviewed spell out a humiliation, not just of shortages, but of impotence. To see your own lines choke, because the world you thought would support the spearhead could not, or would not, is to feel the ground slip beneath something bigger than a trench. Men spoke then of bewilderment. Officers spoke of tactical mismatch. In the end, the mechanical truths took precedence. An armored wedge can only be sharp if it has oil to feed the gears that give it bite. The practical consequences rolled downhill quickly. The Germans, for all their tactical brilliance in certain moments, were not in a position to win a war of attrition against an industrial opponent. Records and later analyses underline the asymmetry. Allied shipping, factories, pipelines, and truck convoys supplied a flow of material that, in sum, overwhelmed localized gains. Pluto the pipeline under the English Channel sounded like whimsy as a name, but it meant steady, pumped tons. The Red Ball Express did what a poet would call mundane heroism. It moved endless lines of trucks, day and night, at the price of drivers' sleep and the grinding of gears. Those names don't taste like glory, but they tasted like mobility. On the third day after Stavalo's fire, we passed a crossroads where the artillery had made the earth into a mosaic of spattered ice and vitrified clay. A Sherman lay on its side in a ditch, turret jammed and half buried, and 2 birds landed on its exposed metal. A private reached out, almost as if he meant to touch them, and then changed his mind. The sight of birds on a tank is something that lodges in memory, life intruding on the machine that had decided so much. I couldn't help thinking how many machines you needed to keep a single spearhead moving, how many men to feed the drivers, how many barrels to make an hour of advance credible. Every item on those lists had to be present. The absence of any one element turned bold plans into humiliating retreats. I watched, too, the small human economies that came into being. Men traded cigarettes and canned fruit, not as barter, but as currency of morale. A soldier would give up a cocoa ration in exchange for a glint of someone else's lighter, and in that transaction lived 1,000 acts of private bravery. People cared for one another in tiny ways. A boot tied tighter for a man with a weak ankle, a blanket edged across 2 shoulders at night. Those kindnesses did not alter the supply charts, but they bent the moral arc of a day. It is important to remember that amid all the ledgered things, we were making small, stubborn choices about how to keep each other human. There were operational details that made me understand how mechanized warfare had become dependent on a web of logistics. Tanks, especially heavy ones, were thirsty in a way that turned them from weapons into burdens. A technical manual might say a vehicle could go so many miles on a full tank. The reality on winter roads with bogged convoys and halted traffic was that mileage became a hope rather than a calculation. In the field, maintenance men kept equipment alive with ingenuity born of desperation. An officer might jury-rig a pump or borrow hoses, but those fixes were temporary, and temporary only bought the time until the next empty gauge. Stories that filtered back into the records, later a mess of oral histories and official communiques, described commanders trying to push forward with the hope, the faith, that they could live off what they seized. That faith was sometimes rewarded, but more often it failed. The math that logistics officers kept on maps and sunset memos was merciless. You could see, in their notes, the moment a plan's fuel line no longer matched its ambition. The Ardennes had been a gamble by the Germans, hoping to divide and shock. It became a theater with a supply network won by attrition. They could shock tactics into temporary brilliance, but the underlying reservoirs of material belonged elsewhere. I cannot avoid thinking of the moral dimensions. When you order something destroyed to deny it to your opponent, you are making a decision that touches the economy of human survival. 2 million gallons burned at Stavelot is a statistic on a page. For the men who watched it burn, it was an everyday thing turned grotesque. Fuel, of which men would later find themselves in severe want, given to flames to serve strategy. The decision was not simple. Strategic calculus does not always feel like justice. But strategy, cold and mathematical, sometimes demands what human temperament rejects. The men who carried out those orders, Brewster, Salas, the engineers and crews, were doing a job that required an unromantic, almost surgical coldness. They did it because they assessed that the loss of fuel by fire was better than the gain of fuel by capture. The rumor mill in the lines spun its own versions of what had happened. Some said the Americans had let it burn to teach the Germans a lesson. Others whispered that it was wasteful, that someone had miscalculated. Both versions contained truth, and both contained lie. Memory favors narrative shapes, and people like a story with a clear villain and a single turning point. But warfare rarely gives simple arcs. The truth is braided, and the braided truth carries both strategic sense and moral discomfort. Time, for those of us who survived, complicated the story further. I have met veterans who kept the ledger of their own conscience tucked in a breast pocket. They recounted numbers with the same quiet precision as they recounted names of friends. Supply officers and cooks, drivers and clerks, each had a slice of truth. In my own small patch of recollections, I stored the whisper alongside the tactical notes. For a long time, I did not allow them to speak to each other. They existed in parallel, as if one belonged to the body and the other to the mind. Over the years, they conversed more freely. One thing that stuck with me was how photographs failed and succeeded at the same time. A photo of Stavelot, taken from a distance, can show a black column rising like an accusation, but it cannot render the heat on your face, the chemical sting in your throat, the way the snow steamed and refused to be white. Photos are faithful in some ways, deceptive in others. The archive is full of images that, when I see them in books or on screens, pull the whisper forward. I find I can stand before such an image and feel the hair along my forearms tighten as if at a breeze. Memory is indexed to sensory cues. As the months and years moved on, the strategic truth hardened into a lesson in manuals and classrooms. The war was decided as much by pipelines and factories as by tactical genius. The Allied side had the advantage of production records note volumes that dwarfed the German output, and that fact had cascading consequences. A factory's output feeds a convoy, which feeds a front, which keeps a plan viable. When you map these things, heroism gets the foreground. Logistics get the foundation. I learned to respect both, but to understand that the invisible work of logistics often does the decisive lifting. Occasionally, historians have tried to put this into blunt terms. I read their work and their numbers some. Observers cite Allied petroleum figures in the realm of billions of gallons across the war. German figures that were multiples smaller, and the arithmetic is clear. Those figures do not speak of individual losses and faces, but they do explain mobility. They explain why some offensives die of thirst, even when they begin ablaze with courage. Numbers are not the whole story, but they form the scaffolding on which the rest hangs. And then there is the quiet business of living afterwards. Survivors build lives that are both ordinary and haunted. I worked a job, raised a family, tried to fold the war into a life that would not be dominated by it. Sometimes the whisper returned in the hum of a boiler or in the scent of gasoline at a filling station. Other times it came when I heard of modern convoys and pipeline politics, when the present seemed to echo the past in different uniforms. There is a residue around such moments, an almost sacred fatigue that says, "You were there. You saw how things are decided." People listen when a veteran says that, and sometimes they do not. I returned once, years later, to a place that had been a front line. There was a small museum nearby, housed in a town that had learned to live with its history. I walked among the exhibits, and there, behind glass, stood a tank whose gauge was frozen at empty. The label was honest and plain. It told of the circumstances, the abandonment, the logistics. I put my hand near the glass and felt, absurdly, a sympathy for the metal. It had been a hopeful thing, once a tool of movement and power, and now it was a pedagogy for visitors who wanted to learn what had been lost and why. Looking at that empty gauge, the whisper stirred again. Perhaps it was the museum's lights, or the smell of old varnish and shoe leather. Perhaps it was simply my mind making patterns. The two impulses collided. I could admire the machine as a museum piece, marvel at its preservation, or I could see it as an emblem of a failure one, in which industry and logistics had become the determining factors. Both readings were true. Both made the past feel nearer. When I talk with younger people now about those days, they sometimes look at the history as if the world then were simpler. It was not. There were clever plans and brave men and terrible mistakes. There was also a slow, grinding calculus that made some plans impossible before they were fully conceived. To be frank, that calculus was less about heroics and more about resources, the capacity to produce and to move things. War, in the mid-20th century, was less an arena of single great men and a coordinate system of factories and rails, of tank yards and docks. Intellectually, I understand that as clearly as any report I ever read. Emotionally, I carry the smell of smoke. My whisper, the little imperative that told me to run, was never a manifesto. It was not a prophecy, and I never claimed it as such. If pressed, I would say it was one of those human responses that combine instinct, fear, and the body's memory of survival. That said, the moment it occurred felt, in the way those moments do, like a hinge. It bent my action then. Later, when I had the benefit of hindsight and a pile of reports at my elbow, I could see that hinge within a larger mechanism. Denial of resources, immobility of mechanized units, and the attrition of momentum. Looking back, the image I keep returning to is simple. Men moving away from a light that had no consolation to offer. They left behind engines, equipment, perhaps some ideas about glory that did not survive contact with cold arithmetic. What they took with them were memories, some small comforts, and the knowledge that decisions made by those far from a burning ditch could determine the fate of those who stood beside it. That realization carries a kind of bitter humility. I have told this story a number of times, and each telling reshapes it in small ways. The archive helps by anchoring the narrative. The records that show roughly 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld. The reports that place the Stavalo destruction at approximately 2,189,000 gallons. These figures give us anchors. We can read them and learn the scale. But behind each digit is a face and a breath. War cannot be reduced to arithmetic alone. Now that I am 95, people sometimes ask me what I want the young to remember. It is not a plea for credit or a desire to be seen. It is rather a hope that they understand the layers of causality in such disasters, the interplay between human will and industrial capacity. If we are to learn anything from Hansfeld or Stavelot, let it be that the tools we build to sustain life, when directed to war, can become instruments of denial as much as supply. That insight carries duty to consider what we produce, how we distribute it, and what moral choices accompany the technical ones. I still think of the faces that day, the boy rolling a jerry can, the small man with thick gloves passing the thermos, the private who let 2 birds settle on a rusted hull. Those faces are the counterweight to the ledger. Historians will always debate the numbers, argue over causes, and write books that place maps and charts at center stage. They should. But let those charts be read with the knowledge that each line on a graph altered someone's step that winter morning, that tossed a man into motion or made him stay. The whisper, its origin and meaning, remains private. I do not insist on a metaphysical reading, nor do I dismiss the possibility that it was nothing more than a reflex. I merely say this: it moved me, and for that movement I am grateful. It made me choose motion over stasis in a context where stasis would have been unforgiving. If you ever go to the museum where that tank rests with its empty gauge, stand for a while and let your eyes travel over the metal. Think of the arithmetic and the men. There is a lot to learn from both. If you want to read more, if you care for the documents that back these kinds of stories, look in the description below for links to war diaries, official reports, and archives. They will take you to the manifests and the maps, to captain's orders, and technical sergeant's accounts. Read them with patience and an awareness that numbers and people live in the same history. I do not close with certainty. I close with an image, the smoke lifting long ago over a European sky, the slow retreat of men whose paths were redirected by a small voice and by the vast machinery of supply. A museum tank with its gauge frozen, the empty circle like a punctuation mark. And me, at 95, still carrying that whisper as a kind of compass that never quite explains itself. If the whisper was warning, a memory, or simply the body's clever way of speaking in crisis, it does not much matter now. What matters is that it moved me, and what moved me sits within a larger, unglamorous truth. In the modern world, industry and logistics are generals in their own right. If this story touched you, or if you want to explore the sources that informed it, please check the links in the description for primary documents and recommended museums. There you can read the war diaries, see photographs, and, if you can, walk among the metal relics and their frozen gauges. They are mute, but together with the archives, they speak volumes about how wars are made and how men like me find reasons to run.